Loving Lord, thank you for this opportunity to come together. Such an important topic where we together, we respect, where we are told to respect each other, the image bearers of God. We are told to see God in each other, but still we stigmatize, we exclude, we marginalize. Forgive us for that. Help us in this webinar to understand the reason for these things. Help us to design ways with your wisdom to overcome and eradicate stigma. Thank you, Father, for the resource persons who have come and for all the people who have joined in this time. Guide us and give us wisdom and help us to become better people as we work to overcome HIV stigma. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you so much, Manoj, for the prayer. My name is Gracia Violeta Ros. I am a person living with HIV, and I am an anthropologist currently. I am leading the HIV program in the World Council of Churches, and the purpose of this webinar is to challenge our ideas about HIV stigma and discrimination and to rethink this topic. We know, despite of the progress on HIV, the HIV response, stigma remains, prevails in communities and causing a lot of damage to people who need access to prevention and treatment. And we are going to hear some of those stories today. Thank you, Manoj, for making the prayer and opening this space. Dr. Manoj Kurian is the coordinator of the World Council of Churches, Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance. He's leading the food campaign and the HIV campaign since 2015. And from 1999 and until 2012, Dr. Kurian was leading the health and healing work on WCC, the World Council of Churches. And he also worked in the International AIDS Society. He will also give us concluding remarks. And in the work of Dr. Manoj Kurian, we had a lot of experience on stigma. But now I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Kenneth Matata, who is the director of the Public Witness and Diaconia in the World Council of Churches. He's going to tell us about stigma, HIV stigma and discrimination as a cross-cutting and damaging dimension of health and well-being. Dr. Matata, please.
Thank you very much, Gracia, for hosting this, organizing this webinar, and also for inviting all our partners to be part of this conversation. We are aware that the WCC has been at the forefront of addressing HIV and AIDS since 1984, supporting churches to become competent in responding to HIV. The WCC has put this work towards eliminating HIV and AIDS stigma and discrimination as a core area of intervention. The faith sector, with the right information about HIV, can become a source of hope and reconciliation and education. That is why the faith sector is a key actor responding to HIV stigma and discrimination, given our influence and outreach to communities. HIV stigma and discrimination remain as one of the main challenges for the HIV response, limiting access for all people who need services. So this is a serious topic, and we are grateful that you are raising this and putting it back on the agenda for churches' work in HIV. We know one of the results of HIV stigma and discrimination is further isolation of people and communities which are already vulnerable, taking them away from the services and adding to their health challenges. And in addition to the other health challenges, they have to deal with questions of mental health. We have heard many testimonies of people living with HIV who witnessed and succumbed to challenges, and some of them even ending up in death, not because of HIV, but because of the chronic depression and stigma and discrimination. The response to HIV stigma and discrimination by the faith sector is therefore an issue of justice and reconciliation. And we are grateful for this Zoom conversation and roundtable, whose objective is to reopen and deepen the conversation about HIV stigma and discrimination based on evidence and seeing it with programmatic lens in the context of faith and theology. We will review some studies, current programs, and we will explore theological reflections on the manifestations of stigma and discrimination in HIV, and the aim being to promote a collective thinking and to sharpen our response. All of us will understand how it feels to be isolated and discriminated, and therefore we can understand a little of what it means to live with HIV and feel discriminated and stigmatized. We have to challenge and to change our thinking. We have to make it right. We have to create just and welcoming communities for people living with HIV and affected communities. So this is an issue at the heart of Christian identity. It's at the heart of what it means to be a welcoming and inclusive Christian community. And I look forward to learning from the experiences and testimonies that are going to be shared today. And thank you for being part of this conversation. We look forward to your meaningful contribution. Back to you, Gracia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matata. It's very important to have the leadership of WCC concerned and acting and taking action in this very important topic for communities living with HIV. We are also going to hear opening remarks from Dr. Umuyana Rujeje. She's based in Johannesburg, South Africa. She is the head of human rights at UNAIDS. She's a human rights lawyer. She has played a leading role in several human rights cases advancing the right to health and access to medicines. She has led policy development and law reform that has helped to realize access to health, particularly for vulnerable groups. Welcome so much, and we are listening to you.
Thank you, Violetta, and thank you to the World Council of Churches for organizing this incredibly important discussion. This roundtable comes at a very important moment, as we have seen in the news. We have known about the destructive power of HIV-related stigma and discrimination since the early days of the pandemic, and yet stigma still persists today. I'm speaking to you today from Johannesburg, South Africa, a place where we experienced AIDS denialism and extreme stigma and discrimination. People living with HIV died without access to treatment and experienced violence and ostracization because of their HIV status. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was a powerful voice for human rights and for the end of AIDS denialism. Many of you will be familiar with his work. He opposed injustice against the LGBTQ community with the very same passion that he had opposed apartheid in the decades before. And we need that same passion from the faith-based community today. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was a rare and lone voice, particularly on the African continent. And we do need to see increased leadership from the faith-based community today, because the lives of communities are at risk all over the world. UNAIDS reported last year that across 55 countries with recent data, a median of 59% of people harbored discriminatory attitudes towards people living with HIV. The data shows that more than 10% of people living with HIV experience stigma and discrimination in healthcare settings, and that is in 17 out of 23 countries. Members of key populations are especially affected. So these stats have real life consequences. The modeling done in 2021 showed that the failure to address stigma and discrimination and its causes would lead to 2.5 million additional people acquiring HIV and 1.7 million people dying of AIDS-related illnesses by 2030. It cannot be that today in 2023 and looking towards 2030, that we are still talking about people dying unnecessarily. We know that people who anticipate or have experienced stigma and discrimination are less likely to access healthcare services. We know that to tackle stigma, we must confront the drivers of stigma, including myths and misunderstandings, the harmful social and cultural norms, and discriminatory legal environments, including criminalization of human beings because of who they are or because of their HIV status. We also have to have an intersectional approach. It is not enough to address only HIV stigma, but all stigma and discrimination that undermines the response, including against key populations and addressing harmful gender norms. It's for this reason that the Global AIDS Strategy created the societal enabler targets. These targets require countries to take concrete action to address stigma in communities, in healthcare settings, and critically among law enforcement. They require a focus on stigma affecting women and girls, key populations, and people living with HIV, as well as the drivers of stigma. We know that social norm change is not easy. It requires a whole of society approach, which is why the Global Partnership for Action calls for stigma reduction across health, justice, community, education, workplace, and humanitarian settings. It requires the nurturing of inclusive communities. Reverend Tata just spoke about that. And this is why I say that the faith community has a truly critical role to play here. I look forward to the discussions today to talk about how best we can reduce stigma and discrimination and foster communities that leave no one behind. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Umundiana, for highlighting this very, very important part of the HIV response. We are going to have two panels today. The first one is going to analyze HIV stigma and discrimination from the point of view of operations, programs going on. And the second panel will analyze stigma and discrimination from the point of view of faith and theology. So now we are going to listen from Pim Luce. Pim Luce is the program officer for the Stigma Index in the global network of people living with HIV. She's a passionate young HIV activist. She has been involved in the HIV movement since the age of 12, together with her mother, who is living with HIV, and one of the founding members of the international community of women living with HIV. Pim has a master's degree in child development from the University of Amsterdam. Since 2018, she has been working in the global network of people living with HIV as the officer for the Stigma Index, which is a study that this network is conducting globally about the stigma. She's based in her hometown, Amsterdam, and together with her colleagues is coordinating this Stigma Index globally and provide technical assistance to country team throughout the process of implementation of this survey. Welcome, Pim, and I'm very, very happy to meet you. You really are a great, vibrant young advocate. Welcome, we listen to you.
Thank you so much, Violeta, and thank you for having me here today and having me share some information and experiences from the Stigma Index program. You've already mentioned a little bit about it, and most likely some people here have heard about the Stigma Index program, but I'm going to start off with a little bit of background for who doesn't know about it. The PL-HIV Stigma Index is a standardized research program that is developed by and led by people living with HIV in order to document stigma and discrimination experienced by people living with HIV in all their diversity. It first started in 2008, so this program has been running for about 15 years. It's a community-led research whereby the process is as important as the results. The process itself aims to build the capacity of PL-HIV and to really form like community mobilization efforts and partnership building, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. The program is managed by an international partnership consisting of GMP+, ICW, and UNAIDS, and we receive technical support from Johns Hopkins University as well. But the implementations of the study itself are led by national networks of PL-HIV. The implementations always take place at a national level. So that's an important point here. We coordinate the process overall and provide technical support, but the implementations are really conducted by networks of people living with HIV at a national level. So far, the Stigma Index has been implemented in more than 100 countries. And in 2018, the Stigma Index was updated to version 2.0 to really reflect changes in the global HIV epidemic and the response. And since right before the COVID pandemic, we also introduced a standardized methodology so that we really have that increased level of comparability across time and across different settings. So that's for a little bit of background. And now I'm going to share my screen for a second to show you what we call our Stigma Index journey map. My computer needs a second. Yeah, I think there we go. So here you can see what we call the Stigma Index journey. Like I said, it's a process. We start off on the right top where we see the Stigma Index implementation. So this is the implementation of the study itself, the standardized questionnaire. And what we do here is we really collect quantitative data. As I just mentioned, part of the process is community mobilization to really bring the community together and make sure we collectively engage and address HIV-related stigma and discrimination. Part of the process as well is capacity development. We always really make sure that it's fully led and owned by people living with HIV. However, of course, we need to also think about partnerships. So partnerships building is another critical aspect of the process. And what we usually see at the start of implementations is that a steering committee is formed consisting of different national stakeholders in the HIV response. They will form an advisory body and really provide input throughout the implementation process. And therefore, will also likely be engaged in the follow-up actions. Once we then have all that evidence, it's important we put it to use. We don't want to implement the Stigma Index just to collect evidence. We need to take action once we have that evidence. So part of the process is really once we have that final report that we come up with an evidence-based advocacy plan. Once we do our advocacy activities, we need to, of course, monitor impact and evaluate those actions. And then we get back to the Stigma Index implementation because we really do see this as a continuous process. Stigma evolves over time, and we need to measure how our actions have effect. So every 3 or 4 years, a country can do another round of Stigma Index implementations to see what has changed, what are our priority areas for action. And Harry will speak about this in the next session, but this is also where the Stigma Index has a really close link to the Global Partnership for Action to Eliminate Stigma. Because with the Stigma Index data, we can really tell what are the priority areas, which settings require the most urgent action. So that is the Stigma Index journey map. I'm going to stop sharing. Yes. Also, I wanted to share that the Stigma Index questionnaire, it's a very extensive questionnaire, and it includes 2 questions about the ability of people living with HIV to practice a religion or faith, and how that has been, or if that has been influenced by their HIV status. There is also a question that we ask all respondents about whether they've been excluded from religious activities or places of worship due to their HIV status. So that's just a few examples of what types of data we can get from the Stigma Index. And besides just having those overall percentages, we can, of course, disaggregate the data to see if there's any differences for populations of people living with HIV. Maybe certain key populations experience this more or less, or women. So we have those overall data, and we can really dive into that to see how this affects different populations of people living with HIV. We also have a video that was made in 2020 by the Zimbabwean National Network of People Living with HIV, ZNMP+, that I think shows a really beautiful example of how the Stigma Index data can lead to concrete actions for advocacy. So what they've done is they found in their 2014 Stigma Index study, so that's a little while ago, that 10.6% of respondents reported being excluded from religious activities due to their HIV status. When they noticed this finding, they then conducted in-depth interviews to get further insight into these experiences. And we made a short video documentary of what they then did in terms of taking action on these findings in the religious setting. So they developed a framework to engage religious leaders in reducing stigma and developed a stigma reduction guide. I will put the link in the chat so people can maybe quickly copy paste it and watch it later. But I think that shows a really good example of what you can actually do with these types of data. I think my time is almost up. I have one more thing I'd like to share, and I think that there's lots of opportunities in the Stigma Index process to further engage with the faith sector. What I mentioned earlier on in the steering committee, we can really make sure that the faith sector is engaged in this process from the beginning and supports the network and the community to act on the evidence and come up with concrete recommendations for stigma reduction in religious settings. And of course, we can use the position of the religious sector in the AIDS response to amplify the Stigma Index findings. So those were some opportunities I wanted to end with. Thank you, Violeta.
Thank you so much. Please copy this link and study the case of that Pim mentioned. I am personally very interested on this. As Reverend Kenneth was saying in the beginning, the faith sector with the right information could be a source of hope and help. But if the information is incorrect, it can also cause a lot of pain and sadness. We are now going to hear from Hari Prabowo. Hari Prabowo is a person living with HIV from Indonesia. He has been working in the HIV response since 2008, and he joined the Asia Pacific Network of People Living with HIV, or APN+, that's the name, in Bangkok. He's based in Bangkok, Thailand, and Hari is also the regional focal point for the global partnership in Asia Pacific. Remember, Pim was talking about a global partnership to respond to HIV stigma. So this is one of the experiences at regional level. We listen to you, Hari.
Thank you so much, Violeta. So good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. So as a start, I'm going to talking about the global partnership. This is basically global partnership is an initiative that conducted globally to eliminate all form of HIV-related stigma and discrimination. And this global partnership was convened by key stakeholders globally that include GNP+, NGO delegation, UN agency, and donors. The Global Partnership Initiative recognized 6 priority settings that Umayana was mentioned earlier, that include the self-stigma, household and community settings, workplace settings, education settings, justice settings, emergency, and humanitarian settings. In the context of Asia Pacific, basically, we have 4 countries that who joined the Global Partnership, that include Nepal, Papua New Guinea, Laos PDR, Thailand, and last year, 1 country has also joined, which is the Philippines. The approach that Global Partnership try to doing is like they're using these UNH human rights programs on, which is like in the 7 activities that include reducing stigma and discrimination, increasing access to HIV-related legal service, monitoring and reform law, policies and regulation, enhancing legal literacy, sensitizing the lawmakers and law enforcement agents, training healthcare, and reducing discrimination against women in the context of HIV. For those countries that who's been committed to join the Global Partnership, the result from the throughout process is vary. Like in Nepal, for example, basically the Global Partnership is never took off because there is no basically the government was failed to share the information to other key stakeholders in the countries that the country has joined the Global Partnership. So it will never go to go. In PNG, there's never been built a good relationship between government and the communities, and then it didn't show up. The results are not there. On the other side, Laos PDR, the government have initiative to work with the communities, and the communities also have determined to join the Global Partnership when the country was committed to join. But then the capacity of the community is still lacking. But there was still 2 good example countries that I can share you here is about Thailand, where there's already so much progressive work that already done in the countries, and the Philippines. The Philippines was trying to catching up what will be, they try to do a lot of training, introducing, sensitizing about stigma discrimination to all key stakeholders in the cross level. So there was in the regional level, so in my context, which is Asia Pacific, the regional effort has been conducted to support the community, which is that include the sub-regional consultation is conducted on HIV-related stigma. It was conducted virtually. 3 virtual consultation has been done, which is a self-stigma, household and community setting. This work was for as a joint cooperation between 7 key population and HIV network in Asia Pacific. Basically, we will try to encourage community of talking about self-stigma, how to address the self-stigma, and how key population and HIV can move forward to overcome the stigma. And then, of course, the healthcare settings, education settings. We work with the UNESCO, UNFPA, and Youth Lead is the young key population that exists in Asia Pacific. And then also we work on the legal justice settings with UNDP and Ministry of Justice in the Philippines. Some good example work that I would like highlighted from this is a project that coming from Malaysia. In Malaysia, there was like this PLHIV was being engaged basically in one of the clinic in Selangor, Malaysia, where they be engaged to provide a service delivery by and they've been recruited to be trained as a wheelchair patient navigators by escorting older and disabled clients when they want to access the health facilities. The idea is basically to introduce a more familiar community, broader common community with the PLHIV. And then there's also another good work that coming from Indonesia and Malaysia, Myanmar, even though they are not part of Global Partnership, but they kind of like create a paralegal system among their peers. Basically, they just want to, like these paralegals only happen, they are very needed by the sex workers mostly. And then in Thailand, they conduct the sensitizing about sex workers to police cadet, the academic. And then also in Timor-Leste, where PHIV was being introduced, they been sensitizing the police cadet in the countries. And the most recent one, there was a huge campaigns that going on coming from the Global Partnership, which is more than. So basically, this campaign is just showing that PHIV is just not more than just someone who's living with HIV, but they're just a human being. They just need a support. And then someone, sex workers, they're just human being. I was a long time ago. I remember there was a transgender woman. We were like a dialogue with the priest in the Catholic university, and one thing that she said was, "Romo, it's like, Father, I'm trans, but I'm still a human being. I would like to communicate with God, but I don't feel like, safe and secure to come and pray together in the church." That was, he said, it was very, very touched. And the father came, and then, they talked together. And yeah, that's the one story that I can tell you. Come back to Violeta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harry, for these important experiences at country and regional level. So you can imagine how many people living with HIV are having the same questions. Am I safe if I go to the church? So precisely that should be the role of the World Council of Churches, to make these churches safer for people living with HIV. I completely understand this kind of feeling, and thank you so much for bringing this topic. We are now going to hear from Dr. Kali Long. Dr. Kali Long, she has lost family, brothers, and close cousins due to HIV, and many friends during this, since 1980 and recently as 2012, which affected her profoundly. And because of that, she decided to focus her doctoral research in the stubborn stasis that exists in HIV-related stigma reduction. In many ways, stigma is the killer of people living with HIV. She shared the link to her thesis with me. I hope this can be also shared with all the participants. I read the thesis. It's a very innovative approach to HIV stigma and discrimination. You should all read it. I highly recommend. We listen to you, Dr. Kali Long.
Thank you so much, Gracia. Hello, everyone. I'm so delighted to be part of this conversation, and I do bring greetings to everyone from the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And the link will probably be in the bio to my dissertation. So first, my research was in response to a call by the historian and AIDS scholar Harriet Deakin for a sustainable health-related theory of HIV stigma. So there are many proposals, but there's no general consensus where people have settled on one health-related theory of HIV stigma. And secondly, I was incredibly frustrated that so little research adopted a trauma-informed approach to understanding HIV-related stigma, or stigmas, and how dualistic binary thinking traps us in a world of us and them, good and bad, love and hate, a world with little nuance. So I wanted my research to take a step back and reframe how I looked at HIV-related stigma beyond biology and beyond behavior. And my starting point was trauma studies, which gave me the critical tools to do much needed decolonial work. And I wanted to see what the unfitting stories, the stories that we never kind of see in our research, said about the disease, specifically within two contexts, the Canadian and South African contexts, given that the entanglement of events and conditions surrounding HIV in watershed moments, when decolonial work collides with ongoing histories of colonial violence, persists, because in both these countries, colonial structures continue to be reproduced and replicated. So if we agree in listening to everybody that stigma remains one of the most persistent barriers in response to the disease, and for many increasingly a hidden form of discrimination, then we can, I think, agree that we're not moving the dial. We are moving the dial, but not as much as needs to happen when it comes to stigma reduction. And studies have suggested that existing stigma frameworks that primarily focus on the psychological pathways occurring among individuals may not provide all the answers we need to reduce stigma. So illness is always subjective, but HIV from a Western perspective is always treated as objective within biomedicine's privileged position in the medical world. Of course, it doesn't mean that these interventions do not do valuable work, look at all the gains that have been made, but it's simply to acknowledge that such an approach does come with limitations. So by immersing myself specifically in testimonial literature as trauma narratives, I could apply a trauma-informed decolonial lens, which gave me the space within which to potentially unsettle the stasis of stigma. I also drew very heavily on the work of Imogen Tyler by considering stigma as power and as incremental and accretive operations of violence, as stigma often fails to register as violence, maybe because it's so pervasive and insidious. Because by ignoring or bracketing out the structural conditions within which stigma flourishes, the fixation on individual behavior can only encourage a siloed approach and possibly impede innovation to reduce health-related stigma. So while my research, of course, encompasses a broad field of scholarly work, for this presentation, I wanted to focus on the theorist Eve Sedgwick's two stances, the reparative and the paranoid stance, or reparative paranoid position. These are always oscillating. They're always on a continuum, and they are not contradictory. Because I find that in the unruliness of HIV, where does the stigma begin? Where does the stigma even end? That's where I find the most generative and reparative insights within the context of these two positions. So not only do the testimonial trauma narratives embody the experience of living with HIV differently from medical literature, but the stories they tell also illustrate profoundly the entanglement of events and conditions that cleave to HIV in these watershed moments when the body living with HIV is grafted onto these pre-existing discourses. So therefore, locating HIV-related stigma is oscillating between the reparative and the paranoid position. And the paranoid position is really the world of biomedicine, allows us to keep challenging the reception and response to persistent scenes of threat and punishment that have always been projected through the representation of the body living with HIV. So when it comes to the paranoid position, can these conditions and drivers be described in paranoid terms? Of course they can. Within the realm of biomedicine, the paranoid position's expository and constative logic works really well with data, aggregated and disaggregated data, that points to the social and historical conditions that make key populations already vulnerable to HIV even more vulnerable to stigma. As an expository practice, paranoia works really, really well in revealing secrets and outing mistakes. But I think, as we all know, stigma is never just stigma, and it is always enmeshed in power relations. It's always relational, it's always in flux, it's never a single event, and it always operates within an ecosystem of history and ideology. So what the reparative position gives us, however, is that it works exceptionally well with the personal accounts of vulnerability, precarity, suffering, traumatic encounter, as the medical humanities, which isn't always foregrounded, have shown us. The reparative position also provides the space to capture the pain and suffering associated with stigma as a traumatic encounter. And then just to wrap up, by adopting a reparative approach when focusing on the structural elements of HIV-related stigma, by countering epistemic injustice, whose knowledge counts, with the intentional foregrounding of Indigenous knowledge, and by thinking in terms of the long durée of stigma as a traumatic encounter, HIV reduction, stigma reduction can then do much more than recognize the wrongs of stigma behavior. It means that we'll have to commit to the often painful and labor-intensive work that comes with disaggregated data, but along with aggregated findings, because it's on a continuum. It's not an easy task, and one that may not deliver a perfectly formed, quantifiable outcome, but it is scalable, and it does have the extraordinary power to go beyond biology and behavior, and the possibilities that come with that, because we haven't quite taken the necessary step into the reparative realm. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Callie Long. You bring these new insights that I personally never heard in my 23 years living with HIV. You know, the relation with ideology, with power, the relational aspect of stigma, and the reparative approach, which is very, very important. We don't want just to have, you know, information about how is stigma, but repair the damage and the epistemic justice. Thank you so much. I shared the link of your thesis in the chat, and also the link of the HIV Stigma Index, so you can copy and continue studying this and see how our actions in different communities are doing this or may improve. The last speaker of the first panel is Nadine Ferris-France. Nadine is co-founder of Beyond the Stigma, and she is the CEO of Beyond the Stigma. This is an Irish NGO working on self-stigma, shame, and mental health. Nadine has spent 25 years working in HIV and global health within United Nations and civil society agencies, as well as in academic institutions in Asia, Africa, and her home country, Ireland. As an HIV activist, she has worked to raise awareness and make change happen in relation to stigma and discrimination for the past 25 years. In the past 10 years, she's extremely passionate about self-stigma and self-worth. She's currently completing a PhD on self-stigma in Ireland. Welcome, Nadine, and we are listening to you.
Thank you, Violetta. Thank you, everybody. And really, really good to be here and fascinating to be in a conversation on stigma. Nothing I like better, so important. So today in our discussions, you asked me to speak about self-stigma, and you asked me to share specifically the work program that we have been working on in Zimbabwe with young people living with HIV. So I'll try and do that as quick as I can in the 7 minutes. I'm going to share some slides, just a few to help everybody follow along. Hope you can see them. So I'm talking about internal stigma, self-stigma. And, you know, we talk about stigma a lot, but we often don't talk about self-stigma and what it is and why it's important. So, you know, it's important. It's still a barrier, same as all stigmas. It's still a barrier. It's quite neglected. When we talk about stigma, as I said, what's amazing about self-stigma is when we talk about self-stigma, we never forget the person in the center, because it's about the self, it's about the person. And from our perspective, it's absolutely vital that we focus on the person and focus on self-stigma, because by focusing on the individual, it creates the ripple that then goes out that's needed to make societal change. So it's not a small thing. In terms of, we just go here, you know, this is what we're talking about. We can talk about theoretical concepts. We can talk about all these things. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about living with thoughts like, I don't deserve to be loved. I'm dirty. I'm less human than everybody else. This is a punishment from God. I'm dirty, I'm ashamed. We're talking about those kind of beliefs. So the work that we do on self-stigma, it's at the level of beliefs, not at the level of changing attitudes, changing behaviors, but actually changing beliefs. Because as long as I believe that I'm not a good person, or that I'm less human than everybody else, or that I deserve it, that affects how I can access my medication. It affects me getting out of bed. And all of us can relate to that, whether living with HIV or not, because self-stigma is a human condition. And for me, me, it was very significant when I was going through a divorce and realized what self-stigma really felt like, to really feel like a failure, and that I was being judged. So it's a very important phenomenon. The impact of addressing stigma, we often talk about, we talk about stigma. It's time to change the narrative. And we're very interested in changing the narrative to start talking about self-worth, self-esteem, self-love, and move from that kind of negative barrier type of discourse to talk about, what are we aiming for? What are we like if we are beyond stigma? What does the world look like? And in terms of being beyond stigma, this is what the world looks like. On the left-hand side, you see what we talk, stigma and discrimination turns to external inclusion and acceptance. And on the right-hand side, self-stigma turns to self-worth. And then you start to see at the different levels, this is the socio-ecological model, where we, for self-worth, we can access services. We do want to participate in social circumstances. We don't let the feeling of anticipated gossip affect us, and we actively seek life opportunities, whatever they are, in whatever life we're living in. So what we do in Beyond Stigma is we work with local partners. We use an evidence-based approach called inquiry-based stress reduction, and it helps people to identify thoughts and beliefs that limit them or limit them when they are when they're living their life. And what we also know is when I have deep self-worth, I destigmatize myself, I behave differently, and that actually in turn influences the people that I'm around, my family, my peers, my community, and it in that way creates a broader external inclusion, empathy, and acceptance, which is what we all want. That's also a human condition. So talking about young people living with HIV in Zimbabwe, we worked with our partner Jandiri, an amazing organization. I'm sure many people know the organization here. And we started off, we would never start a program without understanding what the beliefs and the thoughts are. So this just presents a summary of the research, qualitative research with young people 18 to 24 years old living with HIV in Zimbabwe. And it came down to a set of beliefs and experiences that you can see where there's a whole load of negative self-perception. There's those feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, then disclosure difficulties, complicated relationships, and isolation. They were the main themes that came out. So taking these beliefs, we then went on to design a program. And this is what the program looks like. It was called Wakakosha, named that by the young people themselves, which means I am worth it in the Shona language. And it started with 30 young people. It was during COVID, so slightly alternative, like many programs. It ended up being a 16 session course using IBSR, music, art, and creativity, working with local coaches who had been trained previously in another project. Adults living with HIV led the sessions. Then from the first group of 30 young people.
Yeah. Nadine, the translators are having a difficult time following you. Can you slow down? They say a little bit.
I absolutely can, and huge apologies to the translators. I totally can. Thank you. So with the first group of 30 young people, after the course was finished, 15 of those young people then moved into training to become peer leaders in this methodology. And they were then supported to deliver the same course to another group of 30 young people living with HIV in Zimbabwe. This is the method. I think it's really interesting for people to understand what we are doing here, how we would work with self-stigma. So self-stigma can look like a thought, like I'm in society and they think I'm a bad person. That's a thought. First question, is it true? Second question, can you absolutely know that that's true? Third question, how do you react? What happens when you believe the thought, they think I'm a bad person? You get to witness yourself and see how you feel and how you show up. Fourth question, who would you be without the thought, they think I'm a bad person? And then there's a way of turning thoughts around. So you start to see things that you couldn't see before, and beliefs start to shift. You look at, they don't think I'm a bad person. Could that be possible? And you start to see examples of that. And they think I'm a good person. You start to find examples there. I think I'm a bad person. And then you start to notice that it's I'm thinking that, and I'm holding myself back by thinking that. And in noticing that and being aware, that's where the power is. And this isn't about saying there is no stigma in society. There is stigma in society, and that must stop. It's about being able to find some power in myself and loving myself. And if I love myself, I have a chance then that you will love me. That is the approach. These are the types of topics that are in the session, and again, important for people to understand. Working on self-stigma, this is where we need to look. These kind of topics, and then this is what it looks like inside. The young people are so creative. This was some of the we captured it graphically. You can see that we're working on emotions, we're working on thoughts, and then moving to HIV, working on what are the thoughts that would limit me about HIV, and what are the thoughts I have about taking ARVs and medication. What do I think you think about me? Oh my gosh, such a list. I'm living with that all the time, unquestioned. You see that we work on the body, my thoughts about my body, my thoughts about sexuality. And then there's a huge piece. Young people living with HIV of this age often are born with HIV. And many of them are believing that, are feeling very, very angry with their parents for infecting them with HIV and are carrying resentment. And so there's a whole piece around forgiveness, and not just forgiveness of parents and people who infected you with HIV, but also of myself, forgiveness of me. This work always comes back home, as is the nature of self-stigma. You can see we work on death and dying and all the thoughts, the terrible thoughts I have, the fears I have. And using this method, we question our thoughts, working on disclosure as well. Just to let people see behind this, there are activity journals, there's homework that supports the young people to really understand what your emotions are. How can you change your beliefs if you don't know what you're thinking, and you don't know what you're feeling, and you have no way of understanding that. So this is some of the material that supports the young people around emotions, around getting thoughts out. There's meditation in there, relaxation in there, many different things, and lots of fun and lots of games, and very much co-created with the young people themselves. The evaluation of this project, we're just writing the paper right now, but this is what you can see. Overall, improved self-confidence, a new sense of purpose in their life. Isn't that what we all want? Sense of purpose, improved sense of self-worth and self-agency. Young people who are discovering entrepreneurial passions, going off and starting little businesses, feeling able and worthy of doing that, accepting people and improving body acceptance. Interestingly, and this goes to the levels of stigma, improved personal relationships and family relationships. So you start to see the changes that go out from the individual, very, very, very powerful. There's a lot of research that we have been involved in across different topics, TB, working with tuberculosis, working with sex workers, working on gender-based violence, working with adults living with HIV in quite a few countries over the past years. And we'll share in the chat a link to the website so people can go and learn more about these programs and what self-stigma looks like within different populations. But I can tell you from myself that self-stigma is universal. Those thoughts of feeling unworthy, those thoughts of feeling not good enough are universal. We recently carried out a systematic review of interventions globally to reduce self-stigma among people living with HIV. And the results of this it's currently with a journal. So, but we wanted to share something with you. And what you can see is that the types of things that are working are approaches that work on feelings and beliefs, cognitive-based approaches like acceptance commitment therapy, social learning theories in there, mindful-based techniques. People are very innovative, combining coaching and counseling and stress management and very interesting programs. The only thing is that most of the work out there, it's mostly pilot studies, small-scale interventions, and that would indicate that we don't really know what we're doing. Many people say that they're working to reduce self-stigma, but when you look inside of the intervention to see the measurement or to see how they understand self-stigma, it's not there. They're not really measuring self-stigma. So, you know, I think it's very interesting looking inside of what's working and where the gaps are. Lastly, I just wanted to share with you one little podcast series from the course in Zimbabwe, from the young people themselves. They recorded a letter. Each of them wrote a letter as part of different parts of the course around their body. And I wanted to share this with you so you can hear their voice and their words. And I just need to change my screen, so I hope that will work. Just give me 1 second. I'll make it quick. Here it is. You can hear this.
Dear me, letters on self-worth by and for young people affected by HIV in Zimbabwe. This podcast contains a unique set of letters and poems written by young people living with HIV following their participation in a course on self-stigma and shame called Wakakosha, which means you are worth it in the Shona language.
Dear me, first of all, I want to say I'm really deeply sorry for everything that I have done to you. I was not proud of you. I was so ashamed of being you, especially when it comes to be born with HIV. I thought you were useless because of that. I hate you so much. I'll allow people to stigmatize you. After all, I started crying it myself, so I really want to apologize to you. Now I can make it right by not allowing you to listen to people when they say bad things about you. I also want to make you feel comfortable, confident, calm, because Wakakosha and you are worth it. 3 things that I'm grateful with is nowadays you don't care about everything. You make things easier. You stand by yourself. If someone wronged you, you confront him or her. So this makes your life easier.
To learn more about this program,
find out how you can help, visit www.ndidi.org
Thank you everybody for your attention, and I really look forward to a conversation.
Thank you so much, Nadine. And I want all you to notice that there is the website of Beyond the Stigma in the chat. Nadine put it there. You should look at these other podcasts. It's not the only one. Thank you so much. The experience of young people is so very important in the HIV response. We have come to the end of the first panel. We are supposed to have time for questions now, but I've seen 2 questions came on the chat from where are the questions? From Teddy from India, and he's asking 2 questions. I'm going to read them out. If any of the speakers has a response, you can say it. Let me read. First, awareness. How awareness needs to be done when stigmas have been accepted and approved by the people living with HIV, especially the religious and cultural stigmas. The second question is about mobilization. People with HIV feel accepted in church when others are not about their health conditions. They don't want our help to fight stigma, but want us to keep our mouths shut about that matter. How to do mobilization in such context? That's the 2 questions that we received. Do any of you have some response? Because we are going to continue the conversation now. The faith analysis, theology analysis will come after we finish this panel.
I mean, I can start. just one insight maybe that I can see a link between these two questions, right? Because it says, how can awareness be done when stigmas have been accepted? I think that's a good starting point, because it shouldn't be accepted, right?
Yeah.
So if we start the conversation there, then we can also mobilize. If people will have more self-worth and stand up against stigma and discrimination, that will, I think, lead to a movement, to mobilizing and to taking actions. So that's just to say, I think it cannot be one and one. I think they're very closely linked.
The faith communities should start by re-educating about the stigma, saying that it's not okay, that it's a problem, that it's a sin, that it's something wrong that could cause people to die, and not just say that's how it is, no?
Right. Yeah. And people are aware of that. I think they will take action.
Yeah. Harry, you want
Yes,
to say?
I just want to share a little bit my personal experience when I was on denial about my own status. I think this is also can answer those questions that, you know, as Prim said, is really interlinked one question to the second question. So, you know, when I have denial, I'm so scared, and then I was become very, very ill, and I go into the AIDS condition because I'm self-denial, because I'm scared. But when I'm decided, I believe I disclose myself. I have the self-esteem to say that, you know, I'm an HIV positive, people living with HIV. So from that moment on, I can move forward as a human being. I think another thing that really that I feel blessed at the time, that why I can come back and become recovered so fast, because I was I grew up, in my work in HIV response, even though I become positive, but people surround me, supporting me. I think this is another component that's very important, which is, to make sure that they are not break. I mean, like, they are not really falling into like self-blaming. So, the people surround you is become the a support system that you needed, basically, at the end of the day, to move, for you to move forward. I think this has also happened when someone already disclosed about their status and they already accepted about their condition of living with HIV. I think agree that was a good part. But then, to make sure other people who have the same thing, to accept them, is another challenge that we have to deal with, because, everybody have the same perspective on PHIV, people living with HIV, key population, So I think this is another thing that we have to work together on that direction.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, dear Harry. Kali, Nadine, you want to say something in the 1 minute?
Yeah, Violetta, I just see in the chat somebody there saying that self-stigma is it's a pandemic on its own. Mongo there saying that, and I think in relation to the points about awareness and mobilization, it's like if I accept myself, and I love what Harry has said. It's like you're describing your own journey there. It's like as soon as I accept myself, and I feel worthy, I feel good enough, I feel that I deserve to be here, then what I see changes. How I see the world, when I change how I see me, how I see the world changes.
Cool.
That's it. So working on how I see me it's not a small thing. It's a really, really important thing. And it's not an easy thing. This is not going to be a little training that I attend and suddenly I see me differently. It's deep work. And I think the churches, the whole faith-based response is so well placed to support that deep work, because the faith-based response is working with deep issues and important issues all the time. So I think looking at what could a faith-based approach to self-stigma, self-worth look like specifically? What are the messages that could be being shared to help me see myself as a worthy human? And then then the awareness starts to shift. I see the world looks different, and then I start to mobilize, and people come to me because it's attractive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kali?
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat. These are really, really excellent things. And my research was kind of at that theoretical level and not in the field. But the reason why I adopted that approach is because I worked for the Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance on HIV for a long time. I was also the head of communications for ICASO, International Council for AIDS Service Organizations. And I've worked with so many of you in the past. And my frustration was that when we go out into the field, that, when people are engaged in creating these baseline surveys and stuff, it is always done from a very Western perspective. Mm-hmm. And for me, that was so frustrating. And then there was the added thing that why is it that we don't understand stigma as a form of violence, slow violence, not spectacular, but also a spectacular form of violence when it is criminalized. So those were the things that I grappled with in my research, because I think it's really important that at a deep level, we understand where these things come from, that they're always enmeshed in pre-existing discourses in history and those structural ideological things that make it difficult. And that I am so delighted to hear these presentations, because at those levels, change is happening. And certainly from the Presbyterian Church in Canada's perspective, while HIV isn't kind of on the agenda, I joined 6 months ago, and it's something that I would like for us to be more engaged in, because I think what the last pandemic did was to kind of sublimate the fact that what we really were dealing with were two. If HIV, we refer to it as an epidemic, but if we refer to it as globally a pandemic, these are two pandemics colliding. And unfortunately, HIV got pushed to one side because of all these paranoid things that happened around COVID. And that leaves little space for the reparative. And, it's like, in many ways, and I'll end with this, part of my research was my brother died in 2010 from AIDS-related complications. And I have so struggled with this. So in a sense, it was, Grazia and Manoj asked me, what is this? I said, it's a love letter to Michael, because I wish I could bring him back and show him that the world has changed. But here we are. So in a sense, all of that research and thinking and weeping sometimes is a love letter to somebody who died from a disease that is preventable and treatable in this day and age, which is extraordinary. And it was because of the stigma that he had, Nadine, internalized. At the end, he had no self-worth, Terry. I mean, he just gave up. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you so much, Callie. And this shows how, although these topics are very structural, epistemic, it comes to us, and it touches our hearts and it makes us sad. And, but out of that, amazing things like your work come out. Thank you so much, Nadine, Pim, Harry, Callie, for your inputs. We are going to close this panel and we are going to go quickly to the next panel, which is going to bring the perspective of the faith and theology. Some of it's impossible to have all the voices that we need. We're going to start with Reverend Canon Professor Gideon Yamugisha. He is the co-founder and current patron of INERELA, the International Network of Religious Leaders Personally Affected or Living with HIV. He's also part of the high-level meeting on HIV civil society groups. He's representing the faith communities in the implementation committee of Uganda for the goal of leaving no one behind, and part of the national, which is part of the National Equity Plan for HIV, TB, and Malaria. Is coordinating advocates for health, security, and development. And all over the years, he's been doing a lot of work in advocacy globally, in Eastern Africa, and also in his country, Uganda. He's one of the pioneers. I personally learned a lot from Gideon. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm so happy to have worked with you for many years, and here we are taking it to another level. Love in any language, fluently spoken, heals. And I'm here. I was healed of stigma, whether you are calling it self or societal. That one is no longer part of me. Why? Because some people decided to give me love. The story begins in 1992 when I lost my wife. And then I was told I'm HIV positive. And then my bishop did the most courageous thing to accept me as I was and shower me with love. It is that love that later connected me with World Council of Churches in 2001. And that love connected me with UNAIDS when we did a lot of great work on the African continent and in the Caribbean. I remember doing 6 countries in a week, just spreading the gospel of love. And it is that love, again, that has worked to change the minds of many religious leaders, many of them living with HIV themselves. We started as 8 in Zimbabwe, with my colleagues, Ephraim DC, JP, some of them are actually on this call. And we first healed ourselves with love. That before we even speak to others, let's talk, let's heal ourselves. We defeated self-stigma. And we went to interrogate where stigma from society is coming from. And we found about 8 sources. One was the irrational fear of quick death. The other one was the irrational fear of contagion. The other one was connecting HIV infection with immorality, sexual immorality. The other one was connecting HIV with the social deviance, that because you are not practicing what others do, that's why you are bringing to yourself these problems. The other one was the messaging that was being brought on board, like the ABC message: abstain. If you can't abstain, be faithful. If you can't, use condoms. And if you can't, die. ABCD. And so the religious leaders now who go by the name International Network of Religious Leaders Living with or Persons Affected by HIV, we interrogated that with love, and then said, no, we need something that is less stigmatizing, more welcoming. And we formed the SAVE approach, which we have been using to counteract that. The other source of stigma was the theology of retribution, which those of you who read Deuteronomy 28 and many other parts, is very clear there that if you obey God and do what He loves, and then you will live long. You don't have diseases like AIDS and other incurable ones like cancer. You will live long. You'll be healthy and so forth. And if you disobey, then your life is cut short. And yeah, so it's a very deeply rooted, and actually even biological medicine copied it from the theologians, and also have a branch of medicine called behavioral medicine. That if you smoke, you get cancer. Never mind that there are many people who don't smoke but still get the cancer. So there is that marriage between religion, theology, and medicine, that as we interrogate stigma and discrimination, we need to see how behavioral science interacts with structural science and how we can reduce. The other one was also another theology in the Bible that is called the Davidic tradition of reading the Bible. And that is where you find that there are parts of scripture that legitimizes and validates power, cultural power, religious power, political power, legislative power. That these are God ordained, God has chosen David, God has did this. So anyone who interrogates power, who interrogates religion, is looked at as a sinner. You are how can you disobey God? How can you critique God? How can you dare say that we need a change in laws when these laws have been put? So we've interacted with that and interrogated it with the Mosaic, the Moses tradition, which is a tradition again in the Bible that is looking at how power can dominate, can exploit, can humiliate, and therefore what Moses does is to liberate God's people from that domination and to take them to a better place. So we've learned in that journey of 23 years with World Council of Churches, UNAIDS, and other team players, World Vision and others, working with faith communities, that there are a theology that dominates, a theology that humiliates, a theology that exploits, that abuses and violates people. And you will find it there in the scripture. And if you are on the right, if you are self-righteous, then you will find everything to use in the Bible. But if you are on the side of love, then you will still find that there is a theology, there is a type of scriptural reading that liberates, that redeems, that heals, that transforms. So deliberately, my church, Namirembe Diocese, worked with Bishop Samuel and others to say, let's choose to love. And it is that theology of love that I bring today to see if we can work together and expand that to statistically significant levels. Because now we know why people don't love. It is because of self-centeredness. Self-centeredness on the right gives you selfishness. Self-centeredness on the left gives you self-righteousness. And we have tools which we can use to interrogate and counteract those. So my contribution tonight, really, on the debate, on this discussion around stigma, is to say the problem is not stigma. Madame Long has said, let's move from stigma, let's go to what should be. For example, we are now working with UNAIDS and WCC and others to say that what is the problem is that there are some people who access love and grace in sufficient amounts. And then there are others who are excluded from that love. So the subject of us, we theologians, who are interested in defeating self-stigma and societal stigma is, how do we equalize love? How do we equalize grace? How do we equalize compassion and solidarity? How do we equalize equity and justice? How do we equalize compassion and forgiveness, reconciliation, harmony? Because the problem is that there are some religion, culture, and politics. There are people whom they give all of these freedoms. They are free from stigma, they are free from shame, they are free from denial, they are free from discrimination. They access the love, the grace, the justice, but others don't. What basis do they do? If God is for all of us and has already given us a commandment, love one another as I have loved you. And if you have any debt, let it be the debt of love. How do we translate that into a systematic theology that is contextualized to defeat stigma and bring the end to HIV/AIDS? Right now in Uganda, we have a very obnoxious law that is coming back. When it came in 2009, I opposed it. This time I'm also opposing it and saying, no, justice is about love. And I don't see love in this bill. I also don't see, that means I don't see justice in the bill. So we have to critique everything in line. In fact, using the community-led monitoring, I have been talking with the Dr. David Basto to say whether we can't also measure our self-audits as religious communities, that when others are measuring how they are doing in health or in malaria or in TB, can we also measure how we are doing in equalizing love and grace, in equalizing justice and equity? And we mark ourselves and hold each other accountable. God bless you.
So now we're going to listen from David Barstow. David Barstow is a computer scientist by training and AIDS activist by calling. His focus for the last 15 years has been helping local faith communities dealing with the stigma related to HIV. We listen to you, David.
Thank you, Gracia, and thank you for having this seminar, and thank you to Gideon for mentioning the work we're doing on statistically significant love. When I first heard you use that phrase, I was at last summer in Montreal, I thought that captures it. That's it. So everything we do is about statistically significant love. And Gideon, thank you for that. For the next few minutes, I'd like to focus on practical guidance for what local faith communities, local congregations can do to combat HIV-related stigma. I'm going to share some slides here. I hope this works. First of all, why are local faith communities so important? It's because they are everywhere and they have great influence. As an example, this chart shows the percentage of the population of 9 African countries that attend religious services regularly. The numbers are all in the 75 to 90% range. So a lot of people regularly go to a church or a mosque, a temple, or a synagogue. So these local faith communities have a lot of direct influence on the attitudes of their members, as well as indirect influence on attitudes in the wider society. That's the influence we need to mobilize to achieve statistically significant love. Last year, the WCC conducted a case study of 8 congregations. We interviewed leaders, both ordained and lay, as well as people living with HIV, to find out what these congregations did about stigma and what the effects were. We are still completing the reports, but if you're interested in some of the testimonies, you can watch the video. See that little video link down there. We'll make sure this is available in materials that come out afterwards. We took the results of the case study and combined them with analysis of HIV training materials that had been done previously. Here's a list of the training materials that we used as sources, and you'll note that one of them, the third, is the SAVE toolkit that Ken and Gideon mentioned a few minutes ago. The result of this was a list of what we call 15 recommended practices to help local faith communities successfully combat HIV-related stigma. I'm not asking you to read the list right now, I just want you to see it. And I'll say that we refer to them as recommended practices because we do recommend them, but we're not yet ready to call them best practices because that will require some more research. There's not enough time today to go into an in-depth discussion of each of them, but the WCC is working on a guidebook that explains them in more detail. We hope the guidebook will be available in the next few months. So today, I'd just like to go over the list with just a quick comment about each one. If you have questions, you can raise them in the Q&A period. Number one, talk openly about HIV and AIDS, consistently and repeatedly giving messages of compassion and hope, rather than judgment, rejection, and shame. Break the silence has been a rallying cry since the beginning of the epidemic, and it still needs to be. Number two, motivate the HIV response by explicitly referring to sacred values and sacred texts. In our case studies, the congregations are often referred to the Great Commandment about loving our neighbors, just the same one that Ken and Gideon mentioned. They also mentioned Matthew 25, where Jesus says that when we serve the least of these, we are serving him. Number three, provide accurate information about HIV and AIDS and correct myths and rumors. Our churches should be sources of correct information and not misinformation. Number four, always speak about HIV infection as a medical condition, not a punishment for immoral behavior. As we keep saying, HIV is an infection by a virus. It's nothing more and it's nothing less. Number five, engage meaningfully with people living with HIV and with key and vulnerable populations in the wider community. Engaging meaningfully means to work with, including the planning and operation of HIV programs. Number six, be careful to use inclusive and non-judgmental language. The words we use often carry meanings and implications that we don't intend. Number seven, encourage all members to know their HIV status and, if HIV positive, to seek medical treatment. Knowing your status is the first step in dealing with HIV. Following medical protocols, it's a second, ultimately leading to viral suppression and a full life. Number eight, develop a holistic accompaniment program for members living with HIV, including physical, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions. Accompaniment was a very common theme in our case studies, and holistic programs were another common theme. Provide comprehensive information and guidance about methods for preventing HIV transmission. Talking about transmission can be difficult because we fear that we will encourage behavior that we consider immoral. But the solution isn't to withhold information. The solution is to empower people with correct and complete information. Offer HIV services to the wider community, especially key and vulnerable populations. This is important, but it can also be challenging for many faith communities and may take a long time to fully accomplish. Number 11, educate and empower young people to navigate life challenges. This is exactly what we saw earlier, and it was a great delight to see that presentation. Many people fear that there will be a youth surge in new infections. And again, the answer is education and empowerment. Number 12, openly discuss HIV stigma and the ways that religion can both help and hurt. Fully addressing stigma requires that we acknowledge the stigmatizing effect that some faith communities and leaders have had, and that we need to change that. Number 13, acknowledge and openly discuss topics related to HIV that may be challenging or controversial. It's not just stigma, there are other topics, such as gender-based violence. Number 14, work closely with other community organizations. We all know that we can be more effective when we work together. And number 15, advocate strongly and publicly for universal access to HIV prevention testing and treatment services for all who need them. Advocacy by faith leaders and communities has been important in the past and will likely be equally important in the future. So that's a real quick summary of these 15 practices. We would love to have your feedback. There is a questionnaire on SurveyMonkey. The link is here. We'll also make sure the link is available in the materials that get sent out later. So thank you very much for your attention. And thank you again, Gracia and the World Council of Churches for organizing this webinar.
Thank you so much, Dave. And all of these discussions, they have to become real on operations, on programs. Otherwise, we just reflect and we need to do something about it. So now we are going to hear about Father J.P. Mogeti. For me, he's a great friend. He's a pioneer. He's been the director of the International Network of Religious Leaders Living with HIV or Personally Affected. He is an HIV activist, influencing many, many places. And now he's also taking other communities under his ministry, like migrant populations. But his contributions on interfaith work on HIV are very unique, and that's what we are going to hear from him now. Welcome, JP.
God bless you all. I have sat here rather transfixed for the last almost 2 hours, listening to all of you. So much information, so much wisdom, so much joy. And yet we sit with this cusp that we are talking about stigma today, 2023. And I think that part of the challenge that we have is that we really have struggled to unlock the roots of stigma. I said right at the beginning when we founded Inarella, I said, if we come to a point where we end all new infections, where we treat and give life to all those who are living with HIV, and we have not answered the fundamental question of how was it that we could allow the stigma in the first place, we will have failed. And so here we sit, still asking the questions about stigma, because these things have not been holistically and fully covered yet. I remember a discussion that I had many years ago with Kevin Moody from GNP+, and I said to him that I felt that probably the worst thing that could have happened in terms of dealing with stigma was the advent of ARVs. Horrific statement, but it's because it helped HIV go underground. It helped HIV become hidden. Some of the commonalities that I feel that we need to look at in terms of the way that different faiths have engaged around HIV, and Gideon touched on it, and it's a very important one. It's the whole way in which we as faith communities have not been able to deal with effectively affirming sexuality. And that is common to many faiths. When we examined the whole concept of human dignity and human sexuality across the faith communities, one of the things that we saw was that Christianity in particular has had a very negative impact on the way that other faiths and religions sees human sexuality. If you look at the karmic faiths in India, they have been incredibly open and accepting of diversity, and yet with the introduction of the British Empire and everything that empire means, with the introduction of Christianity and specifically Penal Code 347, you suddenly see a degeneration of an understanding of the diversity and joy of human sexuality. And when human sexuality is demonized, then everything that associates with human sexuality is also demonized. And that's why we sit fundamentally with this stigma relating to HIV. Yeah, there's so many definitions of stigma that have been given today. And I would want to say, I've always said that there are 5. There are many more than 5, but self-stigma, familial stigma, societal stigma, stigma by association, and the most horrific that we're dealing with today, faith-specific stigma. And that faith-specific stigma is related specifically, I think, in many senses to sexuality. The research that was done, I think it was in 2015 in Bangkok, where they looked at the syndemic construct, at what erodes self-worth, identified a number of things, and we can look at those. But for me, the most important is one of the questions they asked, which gave serious impact on your sense of self-worth, was, have you been rejected by your faith community? And if you had been rejected by your faith community, then the chances that you saw yourself as worthy to protect yourself from HIV, the fact that you saw yourself as worthy to take medication if you were living with HIV, was eroded. And the one currency that all faith communities should be living with is building self-worth, because we are saying that we are intrinsically, beautifully, and wonderfully created. We are the joy, the image of the God who has created us. And everything that we have is given to us joyfully by God. I suppose rather provocatively, when I was preaching in Monrovia on one occasion, I said, when you look at creation, and you look at the way that it's recorded for us in the book of Genesis, at the end of every day, God looks at what God has done and says, it is good. But that also means that when God created my penis, your vagina, God looked at it and said, it is good. It is very good. And it's given for joy, it's given for pleasure, it's given for procreation, it's given for so many things. And as faith communities, we have to find ways of building on what it means to uphold people's dignity. And that dignity must be the whole of them. And it includes our sexuality, of course. Time is so limited, so I don't even know where to go to. I do want to say that within Inarella, we have this joyful community of more than 10,000 religious leaders living with or personally affected by HIV. And Sue Parry always asked me the correct and burning question. She said, that's wonderful, but how many of them are open? How many of them are openly living with HIV? And the question was a valid one, because it was always only a fraction. Because self-stigma was such a big thing still. And in many faith communities, we have seen rejection because of that. Within the Buddhist community, when you are living with HIV, you cannot be a monk. Within the Islamic community, we have had members who have died because they could not live openly with their HIV, and therefore they never accessed treatment. So this concept of what it means to affirm all of who we are will always be vital. And I'm going to stop there because there just isn't enough time to talk about everything, but I say thank you to everybody who presented here today. It was remarkable.
Thank you, JP. We need to hear these conversations. We need to hear about our inability to untangle stigma. I think we have to acknowledge that we have not yet sufficiently analyzed the causes, the root causes of HIV stigma. Yeah, time is very limited. We need to have this conversation many more times. I don't know how we will find a way to continue these conversations. Participants, do you have any questions for the speakers of this panel?
Hi, Gracia, it's Nombeko. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this very productive and insightful session. It's very much appreciated. And I would suggest that we continue to engage more in these issues, because from the Christian perspective, as myself as a Christian, we tend to do things now and forget. So I wish we can engage more and make sure that we continue, because as long as we revisit these talks again, it will enhance our, I'm trying to find the right English word, consciousness, yes, so that we get to gear ourselves into the right direction, because self-stigma, stigma, and the response of the church on its own is a challenge. So as long as we keep on talking about it, and then we will get to where we want to be. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much. We are going to take this suggestion, continue the conversation on HIV stigma. I don't know with what mechanism we are going to think about it. There is recognition for you speakers on the chat. Thank you so much. We don't have any more questions, I think, at this point. We just want to thank each one of you. Dr. Manoj Kurian, who's working in WCC, is going to try to summarize the so many issues that we discussed today. I know it will be a difficult task. Yeah, but he will do it. Go ahead.
Thank you, Gracia, and thank you, speakers and resource persons and all those who participated. It's a wonderful, wonderful, and it is really, an impossible task. But what we will do is just give it a small taster and a pointer towards what was discussed. It cannot be a comprehensive because it's so rich. Also, we are assuring that all these things will be recorded, and we'll write a summary report in a couple of pages and with links and details of all the resources available, and make it available on the website as well, and also to you personally. Initially, Reverend Dr. Kenneth Matata and our representative from UNAIDS, Umangayana, were really set the stage. And they framed the issue and saying that stigma is a persistent barrier. It has got both human costs and costs of relationships, practical costs of actually accessing treatment. It is also a matter of justice, and of course the great challenge that it has been accepted in many circles. So we got all the statistics and the shocking statistics that we still are facing the problem. But of course, from PIM, we heard about the evidence-based tools available and all the rich stigma index, and that over 100 countries that have done it. And what's most interesting is that it's beyond just evidence. The process itself is empowering communities, building community capacity, and we also have the framework for dialogue, which goes with it. Generally, this whole process is bringing evidence and bringing a voice to the communities. And from Harry, we heard about the global partnerships. And it's very interesting to see in some countries it is working because the governments and the powers that be are supportive, and some it is not. So it is very clear that, as Dr. Kenneth reminded, it's a societal issue. It is not enough just for individuals. It's a systemic issue, a societal issue. So even the global partnership level, we know that where the government and people are engaged, they will succeed. But of course, throughout these presentations, it's very clear that the people living with HIV and their networks, their agency, their human presence is central and critical. And of course, the faith leaders' engagement, and you can hear the stories of good faith leaders who are able to face the community, the questions, am I safe? And that engagement is always been clear. Callie's, presentation, some of it was very complex, but it's an invitation to embrace the complexity. It is an invitation to dismiss simplifying complex issues. It is clear that, stigma is built on narratives of trauma. It is grafting into established injustices. So, and it's very clear that we need to go into a reparative and not into kind of a paranoid, kind of more rationalistic and more medical approach, biomedical. It is important to have a reparative approach, and not a retributive approach, as Canon Gideon pointed to, because he clearly, and they were all linked. All these presentations were linked, and so she also asked the question, whose knowledge counts? And so it also links to David and all these people and Nadine. They're doing research at the community level. We need to be evidence-based. We need to gather evidence of the communities, of the people, from the people, so that we need to show that the knowledge of the people counts. And for it to count, we have to count it. We have to be scientific. And then, of course, Nadine pointed to the role we are talking about. We need to address systemically, we need to address institutions, but she also lifted up the self-stigma. How beyond stigma, actually going into self-worth. And what's most beautiful about this, about the young people in Zimbabwe, Waka Kosha. Waka Kosha, I am worth it. I am worth it. And of course, the question was raised, how? That it cannot be. And this was very clear, that stigma cannot be accepted. So this came as, from Gideon, from JP, it was very clear. Now, what the question is, from David's evidence, there's a tendency to accept it, we cannot accept. But at the same time, we say there were many people. Why are not people showing up and actually exposing their own status? Well, I mean, as a person who's not living with HIV/AIDS, I can say that it is because it is not safe for many people. So when there is no environment for people to actually, NRLA members to say that they are positive and they can lose their livelihoods, their priesthood, and their status and their livelihoods, it is very difficult for them to say. So it is linked. It is linked. We need the self, the edification, the self-worth, but we need a supportive, loving community. So I will clearly, Gideon, really pointed it very clearly, verbally, musically. Love leads to action. Love leads to listening to the trauma narrative. Love leads to healing. Love leads to transformation. And he clearly said that it is love. It is love. And I think we need to talk openly. And when you look at David and the findings, etc., we really invite you to look into that. We need to talk openly. We need to break the silence. But when all these things are done, we need to have a society that actually accepts and loves, and actually that people can actually say, that Waka Kosha, I'm worth it. Can you have an environment that actually, and so as faith communities, as evidence shows, we are very powerful, very powerful. We are not playing our part. We are playing far below, our punching far below our weight. We are not delivering. It's very clear. So I think we need to continue this conversation. We need to uphold dignity, but we need to challenge each other. We need to have mechanisms, as it was concluded by Gracia. We need to look into mechanisms where we can continue this consultation with international partners, with scientists, with religious leaders, so that we can uphold each other. We can be held accountable to each other. So we look to all of you to support us in this process, and Gracia will take the lead from WCC to do this. And we are committed to the issue. WCC has started, as Dr. Kenneth reminded us, from 1984, and we have still held the issue. And Reverend Dr. Kenneth and my colleagues, Dr. Moy Makoka, we are all here as an evidence, as our commitment to the issue will continue even in the new phase. Thank you very much. And do we have plans for concluding prayer, Gracia? Who would say a short prayer I would invite maybe Canon Gideon to share.
Okay.
Please.
Dear Lord, we thank you very much for convening us. We thank you for giving us the courage to see where we have not loved enough, the courage where we have not defeated fear, the courage to look into what is possible so that we don't continue looking backwards. But like Nadine and others have said, we look forward to what you promised us, that everyone should have peace, hope, life. So I commend to you the organizers, the facilitators, and everyone who has spoken, so that we go back energized. And when we meet again, let's meet when there are more testimonies of breakthroughs and triumph. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.